Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History of I podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen and Dr. Robert M. Price. Today we're going to be discussing the problem with Paul's letters, the issue with the standard viewpoint regarding the 7 letters, as we've discussed so many times before on the show, and we'll continue to do so. Before I continue, Nicholas and Bob, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, always a pleasure.
So I'd like to start us off with something that I've discussed with y'all before. You both read a part of my paper that I sent you both, in which I discussed the problem with First Clement. See, on the one hand, First Clement is, while it is evidence for a historical Paul, and it is typically viewed as a letter that's composed by Clement. On the other hand, it is a problem for the standard view. The standard position is that Clement knew First Corinthians and that he's quoting from First Corinthians because he quotes a part of a letter that Clement doesn't tell us the title of, that in which Paul is discussing division in the early movement, in the early church, in which there was conflict between Cephas and Apollos with Paul. Like, in other words, there's differing parties. And since that material is also found in First Corinthians, and since Clement himself is writing to the Corinthians, it is generally assumed that Clement knew First Corinthians. But as I pointed out, there's a couple of problems here. I'll start with the first one. That is Fortunatus. Fortunatus is mentioned in the second to final verse in First Clement. As someone who is a contemporary of Clement in his time, which would have been the 90 CE, and Fortunatus is yet mentioned in 1 Corinthians as somebody that Paul knew. Yet Clement has no idea that Paul and Fortunatus knew each other personally, or even lived in the same time, for that matter. And yet it's clearly the same guy. And so there's a problem. How can one argue that First Clement knew our First Corinthians? Even if you think that Clement didn't write Clement, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if Clement wrote it or not. That's irrespective of the problem with Fortunatus. Whoever wrote First Clement I would have to believe, read First Corinthians and for some reason overlooked that Fortunatus and Paul knew each other. And then the other thing I'm going to have to believe that the author of Clement also overlooked is, this is the issue with Philippians. In Philippians, you have Clement mentioned in there as somebody who's a contemporary of Paul. He was a co-worker with Paul. And yet, First Clement seems to have totally forgotten about that detail. Paul died in ancient times. Like, wait a minute. If Paul died in ancient times, and then on top of that, you never mentioned you knew him, well, then Philippians can't be telling the truth that you are a contemporary of Paul and that you knew him. You were a co-worker. So we got a problem here. We have two instances where Clement is in conflict with the letters. And these aren't the only conflicts. There are other conflicts, and this has to do with the details of Paul's life. Clement talks about Paul was in bonds 7 times, which contradicts Acts and the letters combined. Clement doesn't know anything about Paul's vision. That's a problem if you think Clement knew 2 Corinthians, which a lot of scholars do think he knew 2 Corinthians, even though he never talks about 2 Corinthians or anything that's in there. And the other thing he talks about is that Paul made it furthest west of the empire. So the letters never talk about that. Romans 15 or 14, so one of those chapters, talks about Paul planning to go to Hispania. Never making it there specifically. It doesn't say he ever made it there, but he's planning to go there. So Romans is acting like a forgery prequel, if you will, to what Clement is talking about. Now, one could talk about the other issue that First Clement, one could make a claim that First Clement was added later, like the title. I'm not convinced of that at present, but even if we assume that's true, let's just assume that's true, that the title Clement was added later, that would probably deal with one of my concerns that Clement had known. Like, did Clement know Paul or did he not? Because I rely on the title having been there when it was first composed for that claim. But that doesn't deal with my second one, which is a bigger problem, Fortunatus, because Fortunatus isn't in the title, it's in the text. He's actually in the text. So he's a bigger problem. And that one's insurmountable. It's not going to be, I don't even think it's possible to get around that issue. I really don't. And then you also have the issue that First Clement is highly ignorant of the fuller details of First Corinthians. Doesn't know anything about Sophanes, the co-author. He's never discussed. A lot of the more elaborate details in First Corinthians is never discussed by Clement or so-called Clement anywhere. And so I think that this letter was a very tiny letter that the author of First Clement was quoting, that's been expanded upon by First Corinthians, and not just by First Corinthians. I would say Romans was building on it too. I think the letter was probably a general letter to multiple different churches in different provinces, not just the one. That's why Clement never gave us a title for it. It's been later understood, probably because of the influence from First Clement, that the material therein was written to the Corinthians. So I think the influence was the other way around. First Clement to First Corinthians and not First Corinthians to First Clement. That's what I think. What do you both think about that?
Come on, Bob.
Well, it's interesting because I do think that that our First Corinthians was later than everybody thinks. I go along with Von Manen and all those bad boys, and that does open up the door to a lot of things that just seemed unthinkable before. But I also feel myself sort of adrift here, and that the once sturdy markers of chronology are now floating freely themselves, and I find it very difficult to, without really striking parallels or whatever, to be sure that this one influenced that one. Plus, it really does worry me that there's no authorial ascription. What about Second Clement? Does that actually have his name? It's been so long since I've read it, I've forgotten. They say it was written by Soter, a Roman bishop, I think. But why does it actually bear the title of or the authorship claim of Clement? Because that it seems to me relevant in trying to decide whether First Clement was actually written by Clement. There are these two epistles on virginity ascribed to Clement that apparently were not, though I'd love to see what you do with those. What you make of those claims.
But what I remember, it does bear the title. What I remember.
Well, do you happen to know why? I should. I can't even ask. I don't know.
Soter identification.
Yeah, how did?
No, I don't recall right now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's unfair. That's not the.
I was more focused on First Clement in this discussion, not the second one.
Is it? Was Fortunatus so unusual a name that the two occurrences of it would more than likely denote the same person?
Well, I do a combination of the things. Like, there is no specific evidence that I'm aware of that actually proves that the Clement title was later ascribed that I'm aware of.
Mm.
And so what I do is I take the Clement title of First Clement in combination with Fortunatus, and then also in combination with the fact that the letter is written to the Corinthians, and in combination with the fact it's quoting material from a smaller Pauline letter that overlaps with material we find in First Corinthians. I take it all together to make the argument that it's the same Fortunatus, and in First Clement, in First Corinthians, the Fortunatus in First Clement is made to be a contemporary of Paul when he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
Just like Clement is also made to be a contemporary of Paul when he also wasn't. That's my argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm having a little trouble keeping all the pieces on the board, but that helps. Yeah, that's
Okay.
that narrows it down to why Fortunatus would be not just Frank or Bill or something. Yeah.
If the letter hadn't been written to the Corinthians and it mentioned Fortunatus, it wouldn't be as strong. But both are evident here. So
gotcha. Yeah, that does make sense.
That gives it strength.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And there's also a weird parallel to something in Theosophy, believe it or not, where Madame Blavatsky claimed to be in touch with all these ascended masters in Tibet and so forth. And of course, she's making that up. But somebody did interesting research suggesting that no, the people she's referring to did exist. They were cronies of hers. She just gave them spooky sounding names and fictionalized them. And I've always wondered, to what degree are we dealing with that? Is it possible that second century authors are claiming to be people that did exist, but it's not them, but they're trading on the clout of the great names? And that could be the same with people mentioned in these letters, that there was a Fortunatus, but it's not the way he's depicted, or an Archippus or any of these people. But again, that's not that helpful, because you just throwing the door open, it could be anybody. But that's only a shade different from saying that they're getting a known person, Fortunatus, mixed up, because they don't realize they're violating the rules of their own game by having anachronisms and so forth. So that does kind of make sense to me. They didn't know Fortunatus and couldn't have known him, but they figure you won't notice, or they don't know the difference, and so that it would be a sign of pseudonymity if it's in there.
Yeah,
which is all pretty.
I wonder if I can just bring in a few nuances here.
Sure.
Because the problem is, we know we're dealing with a very messy body of literature, because we know it's been heavily redacted. It's very difficult to find anything in there that you can really put your finger on. And one wants to assume, like when we make the assumption, for example, that Saul, David, and Solomon existed, we don't want to say they never existed, but we have no evidence. But there's no reason to doubt it. And the same goes with Paul. I mean, we could ask the question. I like to ask three separate questions here, because it becomes conflated. You can say, was there an historical Paul, before we even start this debate? And then if there was a Paul, assuming there was a Paul at some point in history, how much of the Pauline corpus can we really ascribe to him before redaction? And as you know, mainstream scholars hold up the 7 letters of Paul as being genuine. I don't see them as being purely genuine. I see them as possibly being mostly genuine, but even there we know they've been combined and redacted for didactic purposes. We have to be honest about that. But if we're going to be kind and say, yes, he existed and he really did have something to do with the first 7 letters, and then after that, Ephesians and the pastorals, there's no ways we can ascribe those to Paul. I mean, there's just no evidence for it. And it seems to me that, again, we're talking about using somebody's name because it's got clout. This is a very common Hellenistic trick. We have loads of evidence. I mean, just take the famous Greek physician Galen. I mean, right up to the 12th century, they were still writing Galen texts. You know, people claiming to be Galen because it had so much authority. And they had the opposite problem we have today at universities of plagiarism. They would write the stuff themselves, but then they would plagiarize the name, not the content, if that makes sense.
Yes.
So this is a common feature. It's there in the Bible. You can see it all the time. So then you have to ask the question, well, maybe Paul was invented later. I don't buy that. I think it's far more likely that later Christians expanded on Paul's voice and authority through pseudepigraphical, for what they would have considered valid didactic reasons. Obviously, they're going to justify it, just like later church fathers justified pious fraud. It's not fraudulent if you are saving people's souls. You can tell them anything you like as long as you save them. We're reliant on 1 Clement because it's one of the earliest voices to confirm that the early church did have respect for Pauline authority. So there's an interesting point. I mean, we know that 1 Clement was considered to be a very early evidence of at least the church's attitude towards Paul. Whether Paul was invented or not is not the issue. In 1 Clement, it explicitly tells the Corinthians that they must take up the epistle of the blessed Paul the Apostle. Okay, now whether that was put in later, I don't know, but it's normally assumed to be an early reference to Paul, which means they're treating Paul as an already authoritative figure in relation to Corinth, more than the church. The other thing I want to say is that, as we know, 1 Clement, we're also assuming it was written by a guy called Clement. But that's another assumption. I mean, I don't doubt it. I don't see any reason why anybody would lie about it, but the document itself doesn't have a signature. We don't know who wrote it. It's anonymous. And the text says it's sent from the Church of God sojourning in Rome. Sojourning in Rome. That's what it says. So we're assuming it was written by a bishop of Rome, some senior clerical position in Rome. That's about the best we can guess. But the attribution to Clement is early. But the external attributions are much later. I mean, we're talking Irenaeus. I mean, he died at the beginning of the 3rd century. And if we take Eusebius, we're talking 4th century. Comments saying that, it's definitely Clement, and also linking the Clement who's barely mentioned in Philippians, by the way. I mean, Philippians 4:3.
1 time only.
Yeah, it's a bare mention of him. And then Eusebius tells us, no, it's the same guy as Clement the First. I mean, the equation is the author
Origin,
of Clement.
I think Origin was the earliest one to do that, but continue as well.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just using it as an example of one of the church fathers. The equation is author of 1 Clement equals Bishop of Rome, and Bishop of Rome equals Paul's co-worker in Philippians. That's the formula. And that's a tradition. It's not fact. It's not based on anything that we can measure. There's absolutely no substantiated evidence for that. It's a tradition. The other problem we have is even the church itself is unsure about Clement, if you really want to start nitpicking. I mean, there are these, what do you call them, these episcopal lists, and they vary. And sometimes they conflate names, they duplicate names, they compress names. So we don't know if Clement was the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th Bishop of Rome. We don't know which one he was. So that's another problem. So we are totally reliant. In fact, we're slaves. We're slaves to Roman memory. Okay? Plus institutional self-working. because the institution itself is constantly evolving and changing its theology and its Christology, and it's massaging it, and it's like a chameleon. It's changing with the times. So this it's Chinese whisper. This thing gets formed as we go through the centuries. So we have no scientific hard evidence for the two historical Clements, and also which one of them may have, if they were the same person, whether they even wrote Clement one. It's if we're honest, we just don't know. And I'm not there saying Clement didn't exist. I think there was a Clement, a papal Clement, but we don't have enough data to back it up. And that's the problem with science. You've got to be able to back it up. And I can't even use 3 different methodologies here and triangulate something to try and get some handle on what happened. We just don't have that ability. It's a very messy, muddy pond. How can I put it?
I think what could best explain. Oh, go ahead, Bob. I don't want you to forget what you're going to say.
I'm just curious as to how all this thinking might bear on the Epistle of Barnabas. That presumably is an authorial claim, and it almost everybody seems to think it couldn't actually be Barnabas. I don't think it is, but I'm not sure how you can just rule it out. Is it too different from what we associate with Paul, and so this couldn't have been a Pauline colleague? That doesn't carry much weight with me, but I wonder if that's if that is a forgery. It's difficult to see why, because Barnabas didn't have the clout, apparently, as time went on, that Clement or Paul did. I just don't know. I mean, that's all we've got. I mean, that you can only say the evidence is the claim. I hate to do this. This is grossly anachronistic, but I set myself the task of writing 14 new Pauline forgeries, and the idea was to try to extrapolate and guess what Paul would have said had he been asked explicitly about things like homosexuality, Christology, etc. Are there hints in the canonical letters that might give us enough to go on to figure out what he might have said, the way he reasons, and so forth? And I found it very easy to do, and even if it's I who say so, I think the results were pretty good. I even did an apocalypse of Paul, and I would love to know if this could be submitted as somebody who didn't realize what a devious fiend I am. Well, are these possibly the real thing? But we'll never know, because I admit that I faked them. But the point is, it gave me some insight as to what these ancient forgers might have been trying to do. They weren't necessarily saying, nobody's going to listen to me if it's under my name, but if it's got Paul's name on it, maybe they'll say, well, you should read this and take it seriously. No, it could just be saying, here's what I think Paul would have said, which I guess is represented in all the theories of a Pauline school. I guess that's kind of what they're saying. Here's what we think Paul would have said, because we're big fans of his, and we're familiar with his writings. We know how he thought. But it isn't necessarily just fakery. And that brings to mind 2 other things about modern parallels from odd quarters. The idea that if known people are mentioned, that means the document in which they're named must be genuine. And I thought, I remember in reading Bill O'Reilly's awful book, Killing Jesus, he says, as others have, well, look, there are other known historical figures mentioned in the Gospels, so the whole thing must be historical. And I thought, well, not only do ancient novels do this and have known people that, when the heroes and so forth didn't exist, but O'Reilly himself, he makes this point, but he appears in the movie Iron Man 2 as Bill O'Reilly, TV commentator. Does that mean that some idiot could be right thinking that Iron Man 2 is a documentary? No, or the idea that that two people, both big names, more or less contemporaneous, they could have been in contact, like Paul and Seneca, for example. So yeah, let's not dismiss that too quickly. Well, that made me think of this more recent movie, I think Freud's Last Case or something, in which the premise is, um, C.S. Lewis, I'm sorry, Freud, when he was skipping the country, was briefly making a stopover in the UK. And the author says, I guess it's possible that they could have met. And if they had, what would they have said to one another? And it's all just his imagination, and it's admittedly so. But who knows if that kind of thing had happened, like Clement and Paul and the Clementine recognitions and so forth. I mean, Clement and Peter. You just don't know. People are imaginative in the same way we are. Even in the ancient world, there's nothing sacrosanct about using famous names of contemporaries, especially by ancients. Like, oh, there's Socratic epistles that he didn't write. There's epistles from Plato that are spurious, from Apollonius of Tyana. Being ancient is no pedigree. And so the kind of thing you're doing is entirely called for. It mustn't be thought of as hypercritical. It's you're working with, you're like a miner digging for the diamonds. And occasionally you find one, you say, this must be a diamond mine, or it's worth checking out.
Yeah, Robert, I mean, this as well as I do. It's standard Hellenistic rhetorical device for the author to write the speech of what somebody said. I mean, we have speeches from Augustus Caesar in Senate, for example. I mean, there was nobody recording this. This was written centuries afterwards. We have Josephus telling you what Eleazar said at Masada. I mean, he wasn't there, but these texts are standard, and the way we view it is it gives us a feeling of the spirit of what might have been said, but it is not what the person said. And another thing I just want to quickly add while we're talking about the possibility of Paul's existence and Clement's knowledge of Paul. Clement 1 does talk about, as I said, the epistles of Paul. It mentions epistle, but when you read Clement 1, nowhere does, assuming Clement wrote it, Clement doesn't once mention a text that he took the information from. He talks about Paul as though everybody knows who he is. There's no biography. There's no quote like it is written, or as it is said in such and such a document, Paul said the following. He never says that, never. So he's not quoting from a text. He's not quoting from a letter that Paul wrote. He's quoting from memory or tradition that he knows about. And what makes it even more telling is that Clement has a lot of references to the Septuagint, where he talks about what's in that text, but he doesn't mention any text from the Christian period. That in itself is interesting, because if Clement lived in 95, or around about 95 when he wrote 1 Clement, and we already know that document's probably been fiddled with, shall we say, and that happened after 95, it means whoever doctored it still didn't put in a reference to a text, which he could have done by then, because by then surely they had, the pastorals and all the other.
Precisely my point.
But they didn't do it. They didn't do it. So that either tells us that Clement 1 is genuinely a very old text from the 1st century and has never been touched. Okay? Or it means the tradition of Paul writing something that we can quote from hadn't caught on yet for some reason. And that's weird. Because if he really wrote all those letters in 50 and 60 CE, how come in 95 they're not quoting them?
So
it doesn't make sense.
And this is going to be the argument that I make in my paper, because this precisely leads to my point. I'm very skeptical, as you both know, hyper skeptical actually, of the traditional way that redactional criticism works. Because here's the issue with that. I could bring on one scholar that says, because I read it, and this is the way I read it, I think that's an interpolation. I'm like, are you sure? Then I'll bring on someone else that says, that's not an interpolation, but I think that's an interpolation. So we got an interpolation war going on. My interpolation is better than yours. No, my interpolation is right. And then here's my reconstruction of what I think was in the earlier version of what was interpolated over it. No, my reconstruction is better than yours. And so I don't mess with any of that in my paper, Mike. I think that's a cul-de-sac and there's no exit. It's a hamster wheel. And so what I'm more interested in is, and some may have issues with it, but we're kind of stuck with what we have, and that's just the way it is. And so the way I look at First Clement is, First Clement knows a letter, epistolin, a letter, not epistolace, letters, which is the word that we see in 2 Peter. When we go to 2 Peter, no question, all 13 letters are available to 2 Peter. You won't get an argument from me. I don't think any of them were available to First Clement. What Clement is referring to at best, and this is what I think, he knows a very small, much smaller letter that he's remembering, regardless if one believes he's directly quoting from it or quoting it from memory, whatever. It's a very different kind of letter from what we have. We don't have a methodology to go through the letters with magic goggles and detect, oh, I think this piece of it goes back to Paul. And there are some scholars that try to engage with that, but they come up with vastly different results. And it all depends on what their perception of what the historical Paul looks like is going to impact what they think goes back to Paul in the first place. So there's no objective, unbiased way to go through the letters to reconstruct what they might have looked like. That's assuming Paul wrote any of it to begin with. Now, I'm a Paul historicist. I don't question the historical Paul's existence. That's why I said earlier, I think First Clement is evidence that Paul existed. That's not my problem. What I'm saying is, beyond what First Clement is saying is in that letter, well, at least what the author can recall is in that letter, that's it. I do not trust anybody's judgment to go through the letters and randomly pick this piece goes back to him, that piece goes back to him. We don't have the ability to know that. We can make up a proto First Corinthians. Like, I think the first 5 chapters are authentic. Everything else is added. How do you know that? Do you have manuscript evidence? Or if you don't have manuscript evidence, do you have an early source that tells you that they only know the first 5 chapters? External evidence, nothing. So then, how do you know? You don't. It's a hypothetical. It's a difference between a hypothetical document and a hypothetical redaction. That's a hypothetical redaction. We don't know it. So you're thinking. So the person that thinks that would be thinking that the first 5 chapters is genuine and everything else is added later. It's like thinking 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 is an interpolation in 1 Thessalonians. Some scholars think that, most don't. The earliest evidence you get for part of that being an interpolation has to wait 1,000 years. Literally. I have that in my paper. There's a text, I think it's a Latin text. I forget what the document is called. So around 1,000 CE thereabouts. It's only missing 1 Thessalonians 2:16, if I remember correctly. So part of that, not all of it. Which, by the way, I'd like to note is actually in agreement with Marcion's 1 Thessalonians. because it has a bit of that stuff in there, but it's missing verse 16 about the wrath that's come upon them.
Oh.
So it's probably being influenced by the way Marcion cut down First Thessalonians. Ironically, I've seen this before because in Luke's there's a variant of Luke which removes that saying in Luke where it talks about rescuing the drowning man or the drowning child during the Sabbath day. So there's a variant of Luke where it's totally replaced with an animal. Well, Marcion's text does the same thing. So there may be cases where Marcion's abridgments are actually influencing textual variants, possibly in the distant future after his time. Because there's modifications that have minimal textual agreement with Marcion. That's something I noticed.
Wow.
But even if I'm wrong about the way I articulated it, I think there is some kind of connection that should be explored. But anyway,
Fascinating.
I think this is a powerful case that First Clement is earlier than the canonical 13 epistles, and I think that they know it. They know First Clement, and not the other way around.
I'm reminded of like you're complaining rightly, I think, that to start chopping up First Clement and saying, "Oh, this is an interpolation. Let's get back to the original thing." That you could do that if you had a situation like the Ignatian epistles, right, where we have 3 different textual forms, and you actually have some shorter versions and so on. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on there, but you can sure make a case that people have augmented these texts and added fake ones on top of them. But without that, you can say, oh, it's possible, but it's hard to make to say that with much conviction.
I'd like to take some super chat questions. I've been waiting a bit here. Israelite Christianity, thank you for your super chat. Paul was the main character in the final 3 stanzas of the Evangelium, which was used as a source by the 3 authors of the canonical Gospels in the Book of Acts. Well, I'd like to respond first briefly. Well, all of y'all just heard how I feel about hypothetical documents, and we got an Evangelium here. My response to this super chatter is, how do you know that there is an Evangelium? And what methodology do you use? What is the evidence? What is the hard evidence, which I know you're not going to have, but I'm asking anyway, is in that text? Because scholars are all over the map on what a hypothetical Evangelium looks like, and they reconstruct it differently. I don't have time to get into the vast scholastic history of that because it's messy. There's a lot of different versions of an Evangelium, and it depends on the scholar you ask on how they reconstruct it. Now, let's see the second part of your question, which was used as a source by the authors of the canonical Gospels in the Book of Acts. What is the basis for any of this? Is all I got. That's my only question. What is your
Is there a particular document, the Evangelium that he's referring to? I'm not sure.
He's not describing it, but he does have another super chat following up. I can just put that on the screen. That might be easier. Which I'll say, thank you for another super chat. Israelite Christianity. Okay, he says, like all early first century Christian leaders, Paul rejected the Tanakh. He did not write any of the epistles, and he did not believe in Abraham, Moses, baptism, the Eucharist, or the Holy Spirit. Well, I agree he didn't write any of the canonical epistles. You won't get an argument from me. I don't know where this is going, though.
I'd like to know more about the sits and Laban of this.
I'm kind of confused. I don't know where this is going.
I just want to say at this point that we know that the early Christian authors made almost exclusive use of the Septuagint and not the Tanakh. The Septuagint was Greek, and that is why, in fact, the New Testament is Greek. They used it as the basis for all their prophecies and fulfillment of prophecies which are mentioned in the New Testament. So it was it's pretty standard fare to say things as it was written or as it was prophesied, and they will then refer to something in the Septuagint. There's, as far as I know, there's nothing that's repeated from the Hebrew text. So in that sense, he's right to say the Tanakh would have been out. The other thing that one should mention is that if Paul existed, and I'm not saying he didn't, the Bible, the New Testament, when it was put together, Pauline stuff should actually come first, before the Gospels, in terms of the chronology. So there's an element of truth there. I think he's sort of pushing towards that, that everything afterwards came from Paul, but that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying the Pauline stuff, that which is historical, would be the first information, and then the Gospels would be afterwards. And the trouble is, though, that after that, one of the writers or school of writers that we now call Luke also wrote Acts. So we have a crossover there, and it's the same period, it's the same voice, and the impression one gets is that they were using other people's texts to crib the history, to give their didactic message, as I said earlier, a foundation of truth. So when you read Luke Acts as an example, you feel like you're reading Pastor Josephus sometimes. And also the strong element of the Homeric texts comes through as well in some of those writings. The dream, almost like dream sequences where you have, in Homeric, you would have a goddess or a god appearing, and that's been replaced with Christian equivalents, if you like, in Luke Acts. Because, and there's a reason for that, because when people studied Greek at that time, they used the Homeric texts to learn from, to actually learn their Greek. And we also know that the writers of the Greek texts in the New Testament were not that proficient. It's a very poor quality Greek in the New Testament. It's not a good quality. And in fact, some of the manuscripts even show spelling mistakes. So we're not dealing with high level Greek speakers here. They're dealing with people who've mastered at a very basic level, and they would have been taught through the vehicle of Homer. And that's why it comes through in some of those other texts. And the last thing is diarists. We know that diarist information also features in Luke Acts, because halfway through Luke Acts, suddenly the author stops speaking in the first voice singular and starts speaking in the first voice plural. We call it the we texts. And it sounds as though somebody's actually quoting a diary, rather than somebody speaking from their own personal knowledge. So for what it's worth, that's my 2 bits.
We're going to take the next super chat. User, thank you for your super chat. I buy Thomas Heron's dating to 65 AD. I don't think early Paul letters could possibly be written 70s, 90s, which makes sense. He wouldn't cute any text. Seeking out feedback from scholars like Price and Allen. So which one of you wants to go first on that?
Let Robert handle this one. He's put on his glasses. There's a serious stuff.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with Thomas Harrod's work. My ignorance. So he's saying that all of the canonical Pauline epistles are authentic, and but I guess I'd need to know what he says, because I find ample evidence to think that they're later. But again, I can't address with that. I'll just have to look them up. I'm always interested in checking out opinions I've not yet heard.
What if I could come in here and say something? The impression is given when you read the New Testament that after Christ's or Jesus's crucifixion, almost overnight, the whole Mediterranean world became Christian, and that Paul set out with a handful of people and managed to create churches all over the Mesopotamian area, and the world became Christian very, very quickly. The evidence would seem that aspects which were taken over by Christians from both Hellenistic and Jewish sources had been around a lot longer before the supposed period of Jesus's ministry and crucifixion, which would explain why a lot of these ideas had already started to gel, if you like, in that region. There's no ways that 2 or 3 people walking around knocking door to door are going to create these large Christian communities within a 15-year period, as that's the impression given. That's the first problem. Second thing is, we know that there are redactions and interpolations, and that the Christian message changed quite drastically in the first 200 years, which means that even if Paul did live in 65, and he really did write those first 7 letters, their contents have to be changed to fit the Christology of the 2nd and 3rd century. Otherwise, they would have been considered heretical, which is exactly what happened to Marcionus. And finally, to say that if Paul really was wandering around the Mediterranean world with his band of followers, writing letters to all these churches, don't you find it strange that we only have 7 letters written in that period that have actually been preserved to come down to us? That in itself should scream volumes to you that there's something wrong. Because if that had really happened, there would be thousands of letters, not just 7, which again points to it being they're being used for didactic, for teaching purposes later. They're not honest historical records of what happened in 65. They're used to preach and to change people's minds and to convince them of the truth of the theology that they're teaching. So that would be my comment on that.
We do have another super chat from him. User, thank you for another super chat. Thomas Heron cites Clement 1 to 65 AD. Paul or others using his name wrote 70s, 90s, maybe, not before 65, so would not know Pauline text we have. Again, user, no, I don't mean any disrespect, but you're kind of saying the same thing again, and you're not providing a lot of information as to why Thomas was saying this or what his evidence is for his case. So why should we believe First Clement is 65 AD, for instance? You're not telling us why we should think that. I know that there are some scholars out there that argue that First Clement knows the temple is still standing. I don't buy that at all. And in fact, even the majority of scholars don't buy that. But some argue that, and Bob, I've talked about this with you before, and Nicholas, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well. Some will argue that First Clement knows that the temple sacrifices was still going on and is not referring to it as past tense but present tense. What is y'all's thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a nice way of saying this. How can I put this? The problem is that if you were to go back to Rome in 50 CE, you wouldn't meet another Christian. You wouldn't meet a Christian quite like you you think a Christian is as they are today. All right. I mean, you're dealing with a period in time when there's crossovers between different religions and different ideas. There's mystery religions competing. There's the worship of Isis. There's Serapis. There's all sorts of belief structures. And you've also got Jews living in Rome who are trying to carry on their traditional rites. And then you've got what later Jews would call seekers after smooth things. Jews who were trying to get rid of circumcision, get rid of some of the requirements to lead a Jewish life. Some of that tied in with the early Christian ideas, and the early Christians didn't even call themselves Christians. I mean, they were more tied to the idea of somebody taking a vow where you didn't drink wine or you grew your hair, like the Nazarites, for example, which may have given rise to the Nazarene myth, as an example, of the idea that Jesus came from Nazareth. It may be a misconstrual of Nazarite, but they called themselves Nazarenes at one point, and I forget who actually said it, but I think it was probably around about 65, roughly, that the very first person was called a Christian. So these are early days. The stuff that's in the New Testament smacks of much later theology. It's far more advanced. It's more literalist. You must remember, people in the 50s and 60s were still practicing forms of Gnostic Christianity as well. We know this from the burials. If you go to the catacombs, you will see 3 different types of interment. You have your polytheistic interment, and you have your Jewish interment, and you have your early Nazarene interments. And they're using the same symbols on the walls of their tombs, which shows you that there's cross-pollination of ideas. They may be interpreting the symbols slightly differently, but they're using the same symbols in the tombs. For example, peacocks representing paradise, or Orpheus being painted on the wall in a Christian tomb, Orpheus in a Christian tomb, to represent the resurrection, because Orpheus was a psychopomp who could travel from this world down into the underworld, and where we see a Jesus figure carrying a sheep on his shoulders, exactly like a Hermes carrying a sacrificial animal on his shoulders. Right down to the pouch that he carried. It's the same symbol. It's just been given a different purpose. So the trouble is, you're trying to look at the past through modern eyes, and you've got to stop doing that. You've got to put yourself into the position of what people actually did at that time. And that's tough for most people, because they don't read and they don't understand the mindset of that period. And it's a complicated mindset too, because you've got to be aware of all the various traditions that are all flowing into Rome. Rome was a melting pot of ideas. And Christianity, on that note, is in fact a Roman religion. It's not Judaism, it's a Roman religion, because it came from Roman ideas ultimately, and it was literalized. By the 4th century, the literalist Christians had won, and all other forms became heresy. So you've got to be aware of all these factors before you try to just simply say, well, that's what happened at that particular time. It doesn't work like that. I hope that makes sense.
We got another super chat, and after this one, I'm going to ask my final question before we close. Children of the Highest, thank you for your super chat. I think this is about something that I said, but anyway. Please elaborate on the reason behind the belief of the authentic Paul may have died as early as the 30 CE. So I think this is because of something that I said. Yes, I have argued that the historical Paul probably died in 39 CE. Let me briefly explain why I argue this, which will also be part of my paper. There's a section in my paper about Paul died thrice, because it has to do with the 3 different deaths of Paul that I've talked about before several times. It has to do with comparing the content of First Clement to Josephus. Josephus, in his Jewish wars talks about Herod Antipas being removed from power and being exiled to Hispania. In First Clement, Paul is also described as being sent furthest west of the empire. And when I take that together with what the pseudo-Clementine recognition talks about with the attack on James by Saul, as it calls him, what we see is when we look to Josephus, we see a lot of things going on. You have the Samaritan massacre that happened. You have Pilate getting removed from power. You have Caiaphas getting removed from power. You have Herod Antipas getting removed from power, all happening around the same time. 37 CE, like the late 30 CE. So they're all being removed from power in 36, 37 CE. And so what I think happened is Paul was also part of that situation, as best as I can tell. And he was sent into Hispania to get away from the situations that was going on in Judea. Clement says that envious men killed Paul. So I think what Paul did caused his enemies to eventually catch up to him, and he was assassinated. That's my suspicion. And to me, this has a greater chance of being historical. He was killed by envious people over believing Romans killed him. I've talked about it before, and I'm talking about it in my paper as well, that the idea that Paul was killed by the Romans is a result of the acts of Paul plagiarizing Josephus in the late 2nd century. Because Josephus tells us about Saulus and his brother Costobarus being brought before Emperor Nero in his wars of the Jews. And we never see them again, ever. They were brought before Nero for one simple reason: to blame the entire war on Governor Florus. It's his fault. They want to delegate all the blame on Governor Florus. The way the situation's being described by Josephus is a dangerous job. I think it's being implied they were in danger of being executed for even arguing that it was all Florus's fault, and we never hear from them again. My suspicion, and I admit this is an assumption, that they were probably killed by Nero in 66 CE, and that's why we never hear from them again. The Acts of Paul, either way, copied that situation and created Paul's death at the hands of Nero. And one of the ways I can tell, he's depending, the author of it's depending on Josephus or Lucius Carinus, that's the guy that wrote it, wrote the Acts of Paul. He mentioned a Roman centurion named Cestus in the story of Paul's martyrdom. It just happens to be like Cestius Gallus, the Roman commander that lost a bunch of troops at the start of the war. I think it's a reference to Cestius. And so I think that this is additional evidence that the Acts of Paul, much like our canonical Acts ironically was too, was dependent on Josephus. That's my argument. By the way, Herod Antipas died around 39 CE, just to finish my argument. And so, yeah, I admit it's a little bit speculative, and I'm not certain that he died exactly on 39. I don't know. That's a guess. But given the parallels, Paul's death happened around the time. That's the best I can do. And Children of the Highest says, thank you. Well, thank you back, and thank you for another super chat. I appreciate it. All right, last question. And that is, yesterday I had Professor John on the channel, and we were talking about how scholars will often go with what they were taught. Like they'll assume the viewpoints is true without question, without any critical thought of what they were taught from previous scholars. If they don't think outside the box, they're stuck in a bubble. And for instance, with the Torah, the dating of the Torah, like, oh, it can't be in a Hellenistic period. It's all of it's in the Persian period or even possibly earlier. It can't be later. We can't have that. And I feel like the same thing is kind of true with the 7 letters of Paul. I think it's applicable here. That we're stuck in this bubble that those 7 letters have to be authentic. And how dare anybody question that? The holy 7 letters of Paul, we can't possibly question that. Like, even though a lot of scholars will know that King Aretas IV, there's no evidence that he controlled Damascus, we must believe it because Paul said it. And it really bothers me because if First Thessalonians 2:13 to 16 was in the Gospel of Mark, they would say that's evidence that the gospel was written after the destruction of the temple because it talks about the wrath of God came upon the Jews, what they had done to Jesus. But if it's in First Thessalonians, we have to play rationalization games. Oh, it's before 70. It's probably about Claudius or something like that. Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome in 49 CE, something like that. Like, you call that a wrath? If that's a wrath, it's lame. Like, how people were expelled. That's not an apocalyptic event. It's not death and destruction all over the place like what First Thessalonians appears to be describing. Because okay, so people got expelled because somebody died. It's not much of a wrath. But if they're being blamed for Jesus' death and they suffer death and destruction, as First Thessalonians appears to be implying, would it not be more logical to assume it's after 70? But no, then when some scholars recognize it, that's an interpolation, but everything else in First Thessalonians is conveniently earlier. Like, we know everything else is earlier. Well, how do you know that? If part of it's later, does it not make the whole thing doubtful? Or is that just me? Am I crazy for thinking that? What is y'all's thoughts on all that?
Well, I tend to think that Bauer was right, that the whole thing seems to be later. And one odd sounding thing that I think is important is that there's the urging by the author to make sure you read this letter to the whole congregation. Why would he say that because it's addressed to the congregation? What do you mean? And Bauer said, what that means is that the pseudonymous writer is trying to say, treat this like the ones you read as part of the liturgy, because that's what it is. It's another real Pauline epistle, real, no kidding. And it's like all these, you see the big letters I write my signature in. You wouldn't need to tell them that if they're actually reading the original with big letters. I mean, they're hints that no, the scene of writing is not what they pretend it is, and so I think the whole thing is later, and so that needn't be an interpolation. And it's I mean, it's not insane to think it is. It's not pure axe grinding like Winsome Monroe, in a terrific book, Authority in Paul and Peter, gives reasons for thinking that this might be an interpolation, but others say that there's a lot of non-Pauline vocabulary in it, so that's not the only part that sounds different. But I think it's the whole thing is spurious, though interesting, fascinating, but not by Paul if it matters.
I mean, we've spoken about this before many times, and those people who study biblical texts know that the New Testament is full of what we call moments of embarrassment. If you compare the 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' baptism, I mean, just read them. If you don't believe me, read them and see how different they are.
Oh, yeah.
And if you date them roughly in order, say with a 10-year gap between them, if you believe they were all written in the 1st century, which I don't believe, but let's say they were, then you've got to explain why it starts off with John the Baptist calling all the shots, and then it ends up with Jesus calling all the shots, and then ultimately it's not mentioned at all, the baptism, because it's an embarrassment. Okay, because you can't have the Son of God being baptized by a mortal. That tells you that Christianity has changed. The Christology has changed. It's evolved. So they've changed the text. It's obvious, and we see this all throughout the New Testament. And I've mentioned this too as well. I mean, I'm an art historian by training, and I know the artworks of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. And if you look at religious artworks to do with Christianity and polytheism and Judaism, and you compare them as they evolve through those 4 centuries, and then you compare the texts that talk about what Jesus was doing and how he was treated and how he was viewed, there's a mismatch. Because in the 1st century, images of Jesus, he's portrayed as a little senator, with a scroll in his hand and a magic wand performing magic tricks, and he's viewed as a sort of a wise teacher. We have to wait to the 4th century before he starts to hover above the ground and take off as a deity. So if the sculptures are telling you that he was only viewed as a god, let's say by the 3rd century, earliest, how come the 1st century texts are already talking about him as being divine and an incarnation of the Godhead? Because then surely the art would also have done that, but it doesn't. And you see, it's very easy to forge a text, but not so easy to forge a sculpture. And that's the whole point. You can tell when a sculpture's been forged, okay? And those sarcophagi that I'm talking about, on the black market, for example, they fetch more money if they've got men with beards on them, okay? So they put beards on them to make them look more like, apostles and that. And you can tell immediately it's been forged. But when it comes to a text, you can write anything. As Robert has just told you. I mean, I'm quite sure I've read enough Josephus. I could write a chapter of Josephus. Just copy him. All these little tropes, and it's very easy. You can forge anything. So you've got to be very careful. You've got to know what is the condition of the manuscript. Can you date the manuscript? Are you sure it's not a retrospective style of writing that's fooling you into the date? What's the content say? I mean, if it tells you that somebody's prophesying the destruction of the temple, it's after 70. All right. If you believe that was written in 30, well, then you believe in theories, and that's just not science. I don't believe in the ability to foretell the future. Okay, so if somebody tells you the temple has been destroyed, then you have a pretty good chance that text was written after 70. We don't know when after 70, but it's after. But people don't do that. They see somebody prophesying the destruction of the temple, and they say, "Oh, yes, a prophecy." So it must have been written in 40 or something. It's just not common sense. Yeah.
It stops being common sense once you say, "Oh, that's in the Bible." Well, it must be literally true. If Gene Dixon says it, maybe not, but the Bible.
No, it was lovely seeing you again, Robert. And
you too, sir.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was great having you both on. Let me just finish with the super chat real quick. User, thank you for another super chat. Sorry, not easy on the phone to post or cute effectively with my fat fingers. TLDR. I appreciate you, your scholarly approach, and the great scholars you bring to us. Stay awesome. Well, thank you, user. Thank you for your super chats, and thank you. And I want to say thank you to everybody else that super chatted as well, and for watching the stream. And Nicholas and Bob, thank you for both joining me today. This was great.
Oh, great fun.
All right.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.